In this demo, the focus is going to be on creating an S3 bucket policy. So what is this? What's it for? A bucket policy is a way that you can set permissions to either grant or deny access to a bucket or objects in it in the cloud. That's all it really is. It uses JSON syntax, and you can determine if you want to limit access from certain AWS accounts or certain IAM users within your AWS account. Maybe you want to limit it so only coming from a certain IP address would you be allowed to access the contents of a bucket. Maybe you want to allow anonymous access. Whatever the situation is, you can do it with a bucket policy. It's just a way to control access to stuff that you have stored in the cloud in a bucket. That's really it. So let's get to it. Here in the console, the first thing you need to do then to work with bucket policies is you need to go to the S3 management console. And as you probably would figure out, you need to go into the bucket in question. You need to go into its properties. In my case, I'm going to use a bucket called budgets-east. So I'll click on that. When you're in the properties of the bucket, the place that you go to work with the policy is under permissions. And I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bucket policy section where I'll click edit. Now you could type out the code, the JSON syntax for your policy yourself, or you could click the policy generator button. Of course, you also have a policy examples button. Let's examine that for a second. When you do that, it opens up a new web browser tab and it shows you the documentation of bucket policy examples, which is great as a reference. But let's close that. You can also click the policy generator button, which opens up a new web browser tab where instead of typing out all of the JSON syntax from scratch, and unless you're doing this all the time, that's pretty difficult to do from scratch, instead you can do this. You could select the type of policy from the drop-down list. In our case, it's a bucket policy, so I'll select S3 bucket policy. You can determine if what you want to do through the policy is allow access to the bucket or something in it, or alternatively deny. Maybe you want to take the pessimistic approach when it comes to security. I'm going to choose allow. Then you can specify a principal. Now, the principal here is the security entity you want to allow access to. So, for example, an asterisk would mean everybody. Or you could specify individual AWS accounts, IAM users, whatever the case might be. The AWS service is grayed out because we already told it was a bucket policy. So Amazon S3, of course, is the service. Down below, we have an actions drop-down list that applies to the above selected service. In other words, S3 buckets. So what can you do with the bucket? Well, you can list the files in it, you can upload files to it, that type of thing. So let's say to retrieve objects down in the G's, we might go all the way down to the get object action. So we would select whichever actions were appropriate given our need. Then we need to specify the Amazon resource name or the ARN, the reference to a particular bucket. And so when you go back into the properties of a bucket, you can copy the ARN from that copy button next to where the ARN is listed. And then you can go ahead and paste that into the ARN field, and you can click add statement. So that adds it below. And then from here, you can even add additional statements to your bucket policy if you so choose. You might have, for example, certain allowances, but then certain denials you want to apply, maybe with conditions. Maybe the condition would include an IP address, that type of thing. So down below at the very bottom, I'm going to go ahead and click generate policy. So let's examine this for a moment. While you don't have to be able to create this from scratch out of thin air, you should be able to look at this and determine what's happening or if there's some kind of an obvious problem. So of course, syntactically, we're starting with an open curly brace and ending with a closing curly brace. And there are curly braces down here in the statement section. So they're paired, they're matched, open and closing. And what we have here is the action of S3 get object. The effect is to allow. The resource, well, here's the ARN to our bucket. The principal here is everybody. So this is public accessibility as referenced with an asterisk. So assuming this is what I want, I can go ahead and select and then copy that policy JSON syntax, close out. And back in my bucket policy, I can paste in that JSON syntax. If I really want to, I can tweak it and make changes. Notice we even have a helper screen over here. It shows that what's included is the S3 resource, but what is available is, well, pretty much every other class of AWS service. I'm okay with this though, as it is. So down in the bottom right, I'm going to click Save Changes. and it successfully edited the bucket policy. So this is really just another way to allow or deny access to a bucket or the objects within the bucket. If I look at the objects in the bucket, let's say I go into the 2022 folder, let's say I go into this budget2.txt file. If I were to copy that object URL and paste that into another web browser window, it will let me directly in. It won't deny access because our bucket policy allows public access. Because remember, the principal was set to an asterisk, which means anybody. And so back here in my budget permissions, if I were to go back to edit my bucket policy and go back into the policy generator, if we wanted to replace that policy with something different, we would again choose S3 bucket policy. This time for principal, let's say I wanted to grant access to allow permissions for a specific IAM user. That's an identity and access management user account that I might have created already in AWS. Let's take a look at that. In another browser window, I'll go into the console and I'll navigate to IAM and the user's view on the left. And I've got a sample user here called Sam. If I click to open up that user, I can copy the user ARN right here. And so when we're generating the policy, the principal does not have to be a wildcard of everybody. It could be another AWS account ID. In this case, it's an IAM user within an AWS account, the current one. And once again, we would choose the appropriate actions, such as get object, and we would specify the ARN, in this case, let's say, to our bucket again. So back in the properties of our bucket, budgets east, just copy that ARN again, paste it in, maybe put in a slash asterisk for all of the objects in it. Notice that when it comes to selecting a principal, it doesn't necessarily have to be a user. You might want to allow some other AWS resource, like an EC2 instance with some code running in it, to be able to have access to retrieve objects from S3. Just as an example, I'll add the statement and I'll generate the policy. I will copy it to my clipboard after selecting it, close out, and much like we did before, if I go back into edit my bucket policy, I can just go ahead, paste that text right in. If there's a syntax error, when I put my cursor on it, I'll have a red message about the error. Plus, it's not going to be shy down here about showing me how many errors I have in my syntax. I can click on that to expand that to find out what the problem is. But in this case, we don't have that issue. So once again, we have successfully edited our bucket policy.